My name's Phoebe Lowe, for those of you who don't know me. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Operations and Culture at VCET. And I'll just start out by giving a little background on really why we're so excited to be offering this event today and why we're here. So as many of you know, VCET is a 501c3, and it's in our mission to serve all of Vermont's entrepreneurs through a blend of co-working space, seed investment, mentorship, and one-on-one coaching. Throughout all of these programs, we fiercely support racial justice, equity, belonging, and we're really committed to anti-racism in our own organization, as well as in our startups and the companies that they are building in our state. I think we all know that the tech world is incredibly white male dominated, and we are really committed to doing our part to dismantle racism, inequity, and inaccessibility within it. And so with all of these goals in mind, we hope to hold a really safe space here today for everyone on this call. And really, regardless of how large your company is, what your role is within your company, or how far along you are on your equity initiatives. But I personally think that the best place to start is by listening and learning, to be able to then hold open conversations as both a safe space for introspection, and a real platform for actionable change. So to lead us in this conversation, we are thrilled to be welcoming back our speakers, Tony Shula, who's the project and event coordinator at Aleria, and Aleria's co-founder and chief scientist, Paolo Gaudiano. I never say either of your last names.
Mine was
Okay,
excellent.
And who you two have been such an amazing resource for us. And for a little context, we hosted Paolo at our physical space in Burlington for a workshop back in February, which just seems like eons ago at this point. Let's see. So Aleria is their nonprofit, ARC, or their nonprofit is ARC, but I'll let Paolo kind of explain the difference between the two and what they're working on in order to revolutionize the way people think about diversity and inclusion. And just as a reminder to everyone who's attended, we also have a follow-up workshop the same time next Wednesday focused on startup inclusion. So I'll put that link in the chat here. And really feel free to pop questions into the chat as we go. You can message any of us, me, Tony, or Paolo directly if you wish to ask something kind of anonymously, or raise your hand along the way and you can unmute yourself and ask directly. But I'll let Tony and Paolo get started. And again, thank you both so much for your dedication to this work, and for being here with us today.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Phoebe. We really appreciate it. As Phoebe mentioned, my name is Tony Shoala. I also use she, her pronouns. And we're just thrilled to be connecting with all of you today and talking with you about these really, really important topics. So today's workshop is made possible by the generous support of the Kauffman Foundation. It's only the beginning of the plethora of resources and support that we can provide. And so we want to encourage all of you to check out several of the resources that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about our D&I Toolkit, which is a free resource that's got a ton of great information in it, as well as office hours and some other ways that you can connect with us and that we can support you and your organization's effort in this space. If you happen to not officially register for today's workshop, please help us by putting your name into the chat as well as your email. This will ensure that you get the follow-up information, and we are also evaluating this session, so that makes sure that we get your feedback and that your feedback is included in that process. A little bit about Zoom. Phoebe did a fantastic job of just kind of acclimating all of us, but a little bit more about the specific way that we typically use Zoom. So we are in a meeting format, which means that you all have the capability to unmute as well as turn on your cameras. You all entered with your cameras off as well as muted. And then for the actual presentation, if you want to stay that way, that would be great, unless we are missing anything that you say in the chat. Feel free to pop any questions that you have in the chat as we're going along, or additional clarification, things that we can provide you some clarity around. But again, if we do miss anything that you do pop in there, please feel free to unmute yourself and just interrupt us. The other functionality that Zoom also has is reactions. So applause, there's a heart, there's a thumbs up, there's all kinds of different things. So we'd love to hear from you as far as engagement. Paolo, look at that. He's already started just reacting to the content. So we'd love to hear, if things resonate for you and all of that as we're going along. Another thing that we like to use as far as Zoom's functionality is polling. This allows us to ask questions, get real-time feedback, and keep you all engaged. So we're gonna start one right now to get you started, to get your feet wet, to make sure everybody is comfortable with it. So this poll, which I will be popping up right now, asks, what brought you here? We'd love to know what brought you here. So are you curious about D&I in general? Do you believe that D&I is good, but not quite sure what to do? Do you want to learn how to link D&I to performance? Are you looking for specific tips about D&I, or maybe some other reason? So we'll just give you a couple more seconds to put your responses in there. This is multiple choice, you can select multiple. And we'll do 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And we will share the results here. So we've got 50% both saying, I believe D&I is good, but don't know what to do, as well as I'm looking for specific tips about D&I. And then we've got at 25% both, I'm curious about D&I in general, I want to learn how to link D&I to performance. And then we've got 13% of you who are here for some other reason. All right, well, thanks so much for participating. You all did a great job with that. So hopefully the next time polls come up, that won't be a challenge for you, and we can mitigate that. All right. Oh, Paolo, you're muted. Oh.
Okay, this is
There
a
you go.
first technical glitch. This is very weird. My Zoom window completely disappeared and I can't regain it. So I wasn't able to unmute because I'm sharing my screen right now. So live and learn. Now I can do that. Ah, they are now reappeared. Sorry about that. Anyway, good morning, everybody. And I want to thank Phoebe and the rest of the VCET crew for inviting us back in this case. It's kind of funny because it does seem like eons ago. It was just pre-COVID. It was late February when I had the opportunity to be up there in Burlington in person and give one of these presentations. Those of you that might have been there will see a fairly different format and content. And one of the things that I want to echo before I jump into the details of the workshop is something that, that Tony hinted at, which is that you should think of this workshop. We initially started the workshop series thinking that, hey, we'll do workshops and really educate people about D&I and then come back 6 months later and see what kind of impact we had. What we learned fairly quickly was that the idea of doing a single monolithic workshop and expecting that people would absorb a ton of information and do something useful with it was it was idealistic and it was not really realistic. And interestingly, COVID-19 forced us to put a lot of things online, and that made us realize that it was possible to break things up into multiple touch points, which is much more valuable, as we found for the startups, and it's more valuable for us as well because we can actually get a much better sense of the impact we're having. So as you will hear throughout the presentation, consider this just an introduction. And then next week, we're going to do a separate webinar on a particular topic, which has to do with creating an inclusive startup. And we have other topical webinars. We do office hours, etc. But so I wanted to give that framework. And then today, what we're going to hear in the general workshop is really explaining to people why startups should think about D&I and how D&I will have a measurable impact on the startup's growth and ability to succeed. By the way, I'm throwing an acronym there, but D&I, diversity and inclusion. People sometimes refer to it as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or any permutation of those. We tend to use the acronym D&I, but think of that as being interchangeable for any of the other ones. And as you will see during this presentation, we have a particular way of thinking about D&I. Our focus really with startups is to explain why it's important to embrace diversity and inclusion from the get-go and not try to fix it later, and how companies can leverage inclusion to increase both the satisfaction of their employees and retention, and how that actually has an impact on their performance overall. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time toward the end talking specifically about how D&I fits into the new world order that we're under now as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, especially as it relates to remote work. So the first thing I want to do is to bring up some of the issues that you may have heard or you may have raised yourself. And these are objections that we hear often when we try to talk to startups, or when startups come to us and say, hey, we want to embrace D&I, but here are some of the issues that we have. The first one is what we call the urgency problem. I need to get my hires right now. I can't waste time on D&I. Whether it's a startup founder that says that or an investor that is breathing down the startup founder's neck, that's something that is probably the most common objection that we hear. The second one is related, which is the fix it later problem. We'll worry about D&I once we have enough people. Right now we're too small. We can't really worry about D&I. But once we get to 50 people, 100 people, pick your favorite number, we'll hire a D&I person and they'll take care of it. The third one is the pipeline problem. We would love to diversify, but it's just so difficult to find women, people from underrepresented minorities, people with LGBTQIA+, or people with disabilities, and so on and so forth. And throughout this presentation, you're going to hear how we address some of these problems, but I also want to give a little bit of a shout out about the fact that we have a separate webinar that we just gave one about a week ago, but we're going to be doing it again, where we specifically focus on these and about 6 or 7 other myths, and we provide people the ammunition that they need to be able to counter these arguments and to think about them in a different way. But for the time being, what I would like to do is to get a sense of where each of your companies stands in the spectrum of how much you're embracing or characterizing your attitude towards D&I. I would like to launch another poll. And in this particular case, we're going to ask you 4 questions. So we're going to ask you to identify or characterize your company's attitude towards diversity and inclusion. And this is a single choice. So if you can pick one of these 4, either it's not discussed at all, or it's a topic of conversation, but limited or no action around it. Maybe you have some active policies and initiatives in place, and maybe it's a core part of your business strategy. And it's always good for us to gauge the audience and get a sense of where along the journey you might be. So if you, in the next 5 seconds, if you can click on any one of these choices, and I can see that actually as a panelist, I get to submit today. Usually it doesn't allow me to do that, but today I can do that. So there you go. So I'm going to skew the results there. So about 5 seconds, and I won't do the countdown. I always feel like things are going to explode when I finish the countdown. But okay, so let's go ahead and stop it and see what kind of responses we get here. So, this is great. So it looks like there is a definitely skews to the more mature attitude towards diversity and inclusion, which is wonderful. And it looks like 63% of the respondents indicate that there's some active policies and initiatives in place. A few people listed as a core part of a business strategy. I have to confess I was one of those people. and then a few of you either don't discuss it at all or it's a topic of conversation. This is reasonably common. It's nice to see a slightly higher average than before. Hopefully, what you're going to learn today, regardless of where you are along that spectrum, will really help you to move up and learn more things. With that, let's come to the main question. Why should startups think about diversity and inclusion? This is something that has always really perplexed me, that tends to kind of fall under the radar for a lot of people. When you think about human capital, when you think about the people in your organization, for almost every company, they're going to be your most valuable asset, but also your most expensive budget item. Now, sometimes we do a poll here, but we didn't want to over poll you, so we're just going to show you the results. In a moment, I will show you 2 numbers on this chart. One of them is the total annual spend in billions on advertising across every single company in the United States, across every channel of advertising. The other one is payroll across every company in the United States. And sometimes we ask people, which one do you think is bigger? We recently did a workshop in which I think about 70% of the people guessed that our advertising is actually larger. And what really shocks people is that not only is advertising less than payroll, but payroll is 30 times bigger than advertising. United States companies collectively spend, in fact, last year it was about $6.7 trillion on payroll, $200 billion on advertising. Now, if you think about how much money we spend on things like programmatic advertising, optimizing it, et cetera, we also do things like we optimize supply chain and inventory. And yet we tend to treat our people, our human capital, as if it's some squishy thing that's really only worthy of a quantitative or a qualitative analysis. When you think about the magnitude of the issue and of the value of human capital, it makes you realize that you should really reject that urgency problem. Because the idea that you need to hurry up right now and can't waste time on D&I is completely crazy. And the real problem is the issue of ROI. Your team is your most expensive budget and your most valuable asset. So what you should be asking yourself is, how do I maximize that ROI? And I would argue that any company that leaves human capital maximization as the last thing that they do is making a very big mistake. I mean, just from a numerical perspective. So given that, one of the things that I want to focus on is that there are ways of supporting the business case for D&I. And there is actually a great resource that we're going to give you. But in general, diverse companies are more likely to out-earn their industry peers. There's a penalty for lack of diversity. And I'm not sure what it says, have grown. This is an interesting typo on that slide. And in general, other data that show that employees are 3 times more likely to anticipate leaving their company when their next year. This is very strange. Okay, something went really wrong with this slide as it went back and forth between Google Drive and my laptop, and I apologize for that. But the general idea is that there is a lot of resources, and we'll share some of those, that show that there's a very strong business case for D&I, but even leaving aside the specifics that are attached to data about D&I, just realizing how incredibly valuable human capital is the number one thing that you can do to argue for the importance of learning how you can manage that effectively. So, wow, this is, okay. I will not comment on what's happening here, but this is something about going back and forth between Windows and Microsoft or something. Okay. The question that everybody wants to know then is the following. How can we increase the performance of our company by diversifying our human capital? Ultimately, we think of this almost as a portfolio management problem. And the underlying assumption is that somehow D&I influences performance, and there's the big question mark there. This is really what everybody wants to know. However, it turns out that we cannot answer that strictly on the basis of diversity. Why? Well, suppose that I show you 4 companies. The one on the upper left is completely homogeneous, and I ask you, is this an optimal configuration? Well, we may have an intuition that it's not, but we don't know for a fact. What if we add a token person of color like the one in the upper right? What if we hire people from diverse backgrounds, but we only do it at the entry level? What if we have a completely heterogeneous, diverse company? The problem is that we do not know, just simply by looking at the diversity of these companies, there's no way of telling which one of these companies will do better. Now, before you say, oh, well, there is data that shows that diverse companies are better. Yes, it's true. There is indirect evidence. There is correlational evidence that when you look over thousands of companies, there is a clear correlation between the diversity of a company, whether it's in its staff, in its executive leadership team, on its board, and performance as measured through a variety of metrics. However, there are no tools that can guide us as to how diversity impacts the performance of an individual company. And this leads me to what I call the D&I disconnect. If you think about it, we talk about D&I or DEI, but it turns out that almost every study and almost every initiative that I've seen implemented out there focuses exclusively on diversity, and in particular on representation, counting heads, how many Black people, how many, or African American, how many people of Hispanic origin, how many Asians. But inclusion, as it turns out, is crucial to the success of your startup. And if there's one thing that I hope you get out of this presentation, is the fact that we need to rebalance that disconnect between diversity and inclusion and focus very heavily on inclusion. Let me give you a very simple thought experiment to help illustrate why inclusion is so important. Imagine that you have a team, and this is the perfect team. This is the top bar. It doesn't get any better because each individual is performing at their peak. And as a team, they all collaborate at 100% efficiency. It just doesn't get any better. Suppose now that you do something that causes one of the people on the team to feel unable to perform as much as they should. They feel excluded. What do you think will happen to the performance of the team? Well, clearly, the performance of the team is going to go down because the performance of the individual is going to go down. What if I now do it to a second person? Not only will the performance of the team go down further because now there are two people that are performing below 100%, but you start to get these negative feedback loops where the whole team is starting to suffer because other team members have to pick up the slack, people get frustrated, and pretty soon you get a fairly precipitous decline in the performance of the whole team because of the fact that these two people are unable to bring their entire or contribute their entire capability to the team. The punchline of this example is the following. Anything that a company does that makes any employee feel excluded because of personal traits is going to impact the whole company adversely. In other words, if you're doing something that makes people, whether it's because of their disabilities, their nationality, their race, their gender, and you're making them feel less included, their performance will go down and you're just shooting yourself in the foot. Which makes sense when you think about what we said earlier about the fact that people are the most valuable asset for any company. In fact, we think of the company impacting people, but really, what is a company? A company, it's not the building, it's just a collection of people. So anything that you do as an organization that impacts your team adversely is also going to impact your entire company adversely. That leads me to the following claim. Diversity and inclusion impact performance jointly. Therefore, when you're looking at different companies, the question to ask is not which of these companies is going to perform best. What you should be asking yourself is, how often is that person or each particular person going to feel excluded? In other words, you need to understand both the diversity of the company and the inclusion of the company. But inclusion is really crucial. So we revisit our question and realize that it's not simply the case that we need to understand how diversity impacts performance, because surely there is some influence between diversity and performance. But what we believe firmly, and we have increasing data to support that belief, is that inclusion is at the heart both of having a more diverse organization and having an organization that performs better. I'm going to now switch gears slightly and show you an example in a very tangible way of how inclusion impacts diversity and performance. And to premise what I'm going to show you, my whole background for the last 30 years, I've been in a mixture of academia and then as an entrepreneur, I've been studying complex systems. And I've been using these computer simulations to capture the behaviors of individuals and how together they lead to a particular organization and how the organization behaves. And what I'm going to show you in a moment, this is a simulation. I'm going to activate it in one moment. There will be a video of it. But essentially, it's a really simple company that has only two types of people. Let's think of them as being men and women. It could easily be any other kind of characteristic, and we could have more characteristics, as you will see later. But for conceptual purposes, it was very easy to think of it as a binary choice. There are 4 levels, from entry level, managers, VPs, and executives. And at the start of the simulation, this company is very balanced, 50-50 men and women at each and every level. When I click go, you will see, in fact here, you will see a couple of things happen in this company. One is that some people pop up and turn gray and disappear. These are people that are leaving the company or getting fired. And then some people get promoted. The punchline is that if you're promoting, in this case, strictly on the basis of seniority, which is, so the way that we do it is that whenever there is a vacancy at a certain level, we look to the level below, we keep track of how long each of these people, these what we call them agents, has been at that level. We take maybe the top 10% and then randomly choose one of them. That indicates that we are promoting based on seniority, but we don't have an exact understanding, or maybe there's some other metrics that we use. As long as that's the way we're doing it, the company remains balanced. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show what happens when you're not inclusive. In this particular case, we're going to introduce a gender bias in the promotion process so that when people are being promoted, if they're males, they tend to get a slight leg up. Not that that ever happens in any real company, but we asked the question, what would happen in our simulation if we give the blue people a slight advantage? And here's what it looks like. So we accelerate a little bit, still starting at 50-50. We have this bias, just one parameter that we changed uniformly across the whole company. And this is what the company looks like 5 years later. Does it look familiar? Well, it should, because if you look out in industry, almost every industry out there shows the same kind of pyramid shape where you tend to get mostly men at the top. And sometimes paradoxically, you may actually have more women at the entry level than men. And the particular shape changes, and we've been able to actually fit data from a bunch of different industries, but the punchline is the same. And that is, this is a very clear demonstration that inclusion drives diversity. By failing to be inclusive, and in this particular case, it's just one example of being exclusive. It's giving men an advantage in the promotion process. We're showing a dramatic impact on our ability to retain, promote, and advance women. Of course, what I said earlier was that inclusion drives both performance and diversity. One of the beauties of our simulations is that we can actually put electrodes inside these people's brains. And in this particular case, we make a very simple assumption that's based on some literature from academia that shows that when people get passed over for promotion, they get frustrated and their satisfaction goes down. And the chart that I'm showing you here is showing the average satisfaction level for all women in the company in yellow and the average satisfaction of all men in the company in blue. And you can see that the women are getting frustrated because every time that somebody younger than they are or more junior than they are gets promoted ahead of them, they get a little bit frustrated, and this frustration accumulates over time. What's going to happen in the real world is that individual productivity will decline, churn rates will go up, and the team productivity as a whole will also decline. And all of these things have a very direct impact on your cost as a company. And this is not hypothetical. I worked with a company years ago in which they had about 300 people, and they estimated they had a real problem with retaining women. And they estimated that they were spending multiple millions of dollars every year, like between $2 and $3 million a year, because of the unnecessarily high churn. This is not chump change. These are real numbers, okay? So again, the critical role of inclusion. Inclusion is at the heart of both diversity and performance, and we're going to talk a bit more about that. But what I want to do is go back to one of the myths that we talked about earlier, which is that this is all great, but I'm just a startup. For now, I'm going to focus on my first key hires, and then I'll worry about D&I later. And I'm going to pass it back over to Tony, who's going to walk us through some of the reasons why this is not a very good way to think about it.
Thanks so much, Paolo. So to do this, we are going to play a bit of a game. So all that you'll need in order to play this game is either something to write on, or you could even use your computer to keep track. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to think of 4 people that you trust in your professional network. It could be colleagues you work with now, in the past, any 4 people in your professional network will work. For each of those people, you're going to calculate what we call the degree of diversity by looking at these 5 different dimensions of diversity. So race and ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, nationality, and ability. For each of those dimensions, you're going to score the person as a 0 if they are the same as you, or a 1 if they are different from you. So if we look at this example, we've got colleague 1 that's listed there. You would put, of course, an actual name of your colleague there. And then you'd go through each of those identity dimensions and put a 0 if they're the same as you. So in this instance, the person was the same race, gender identity, and sexual orientation, as well as level of ability. And here, when we say ability, we're talking about either a disability, either visible or invisible, compared to an ability, or compared to not being disabled. And then nationality here in this example has a 1. So that's the characteristic that's different. So you're going to go through this. You're going to do that for each of your 4 colleagues, and then you're going to total up your score. And then we're going to do a poll where we're going to be able to look at what our network diversity scores. So if you have questions about how this works, please feel free to pop them in the chat. We're going to give you 2 minutes to do this activity. And on this example, we have 0 as the same as you, 1 is different from you. Hopefully that should provide you with enough instructions while we're going. And I'm going to get the timer started to go now. And I have a little friend that's joining me. And you've got about 1 more minute left. Again, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat. We're happy to provide clarity. And we're down to 30 seconds. The ability one, great question. So that has to do with either if you have a colleague who's disabled versus not disabled. So if you are an individual who is able-bodied and your colleague is disabled, then you would put a 1 there. If you're an individual who's disabled and your colleague's also disabled, then you would put a 0 there. And 5, 4, even turned red for us. 2,
we can even give it a, maybe give it a few extra seconds because I think we started with like.
Yeah, we did start a little bit early. Yep.
That's okay. And this is not, we're not going to grade you on this. So it's okay. It's
exactly.
just to give us a general idea.
Yep. So I'm launching the poll now where you can identify your network diversity score. And this is, again, tallying up for all 4 of your colleagues. Was it in the 0 to 4 range, 5 to 10, 11 to 15, or 16 to 20? And we'll give you just a few more seconds to pop your results in there. All right. And the results are very similar to what we typically see. There's a simulation that Paolo's going to do in a little bit where there'll be like a histogram that kind of shows this. But what we typically see is the biggest portion of respondents having a network diversity score of 0 to 4, second largest 5 to 10, and then sometimes we do see people with higher network diversity, but typically we see very homogeneous networks, and this is something that exists outside of the workspace as well. So I'm going to transition it back over to Paolo to continue to talk to us about that.
Excellent. Thank you, Tony. And this time, oh, good, I'm unmuted this time. No more muting tricks. Thank you. So as Tony hinted, the data that we collected through this little exercise is actually very typical of what we see in real networks. And the reason why that's a challenge is because your diversity and inclusion combine to impact your early hires. Because most of your hires come from your network, and most people's networks are homogeneous, and therefore a lot of startups are highly homogeneous. Again, we're going to rely on our simulations, and the beauty of the simulations is that they help us to see how individual characteristics then percolate into the entire organization, as we saw before. In this case, we asked a different question. We asked, what if we have 2 founders that are launching a company and they're tapping their network to grow this company? And the histogram that you see over here on the left, as Tony hinted, is a typical histogram of a typical white person in the United States, what their network looks like. And we're using a metric that is similar to what we played with the diversity score game, the Trusted 4 game that we just played, which is that 0 means people are the predominant majority, which in this case would be white men. 1 would mean that you have 1 degree of diversity, which could be your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, etc. 2 would mean that there is some kind of intersectionality, for example, a Black woman, and so on and so forth. And what I'm going to do when I click go is that you're going to see this company growing randomly from the roots, as it were. And here I'm just going to keep running through, looping through multiple of them. And each time we're creating this new company by sampling that network. And perhaps not surprisingly, what you see is that the vast majority of the companies that we're creating are really homogeneous. The bar on the left is a histogram that shows you the distribution of levels of degrees of diversity relative to the majority. And you can see that in most cases, the predominant number or the predominant presence in the company are people of diversity degree 0. What happens now if we have 2 diverse founders? And it turns out that it's a fairly well-known fact that people who are not part of the majority in this country tend to have more diverse networks themselves. The result is that when you combine the social networks or the professional networks of these 2 founders, you get a much flatter histogram like the one on the left. Let's see what happens when we do the same thing and create a bunch of companies from that. Lo and behold, as you can see, we get a much higher level of diversity, both in terms of the fact that in this case, the white male majority is not a majority in the company. In fact, in some cases, you see less than 50%, but also just the depth of diversity that you can get in the company significantly higher. And really, the takeaways from this example is that hiring who you know tends to lead to very homogeneous networks and homogeneous companies. And therefore, having diversity on your founding team can have a big impact on who you hire. And this is really one of the ways to address and answer that second myth or that second objection we talked about, which was the fix it later problem. And we would argue that the real fix it later problem is that if we wait, it will be too late. And it's a known fact that when you have a company that is very homogeneous, it becomes increasingly difficult to hire people from different backgrounds because they are going to feel very uncomfortable. They're going to be the only one. They're going to feel like they're probably not going to fit very well. If that's the case, however, given that we tend to rely very heavily on our networks, where can we find candidates from different backgrounds? And it turns out that, again, there are a lot of different kinds of resources that we can offer you. One of them is that in our D&I toolkit, there's actually an extensive list of job boards where you can find people from a variety of different backgrounds. We also have a webinar specifically, we call it 6 Ways That D&I Impacts Your Recruiting, where we take some other simulations, well, the first one that we showed you a moment ago of the company growing, and then another one to show you in a very quantitative, tangible way, what are all the ways that D&I influences your ability to recruit people into your company. Recruiting is great, but of course that's not the only problem, because the problem is that sometimes you work really hard to attract talent that is very diverse, but then how do you actually keep that talent in your organization? And this has to do with retention. And I'm going to play ping pong and bounce it back to Tony, who's going to tell you about that aspect of our work.
Yes, absolutely. So to build a little bit on something that Paolo was talking about earlier, as far as inclusion being foundational for both diversity and performance, it's also foundational for ensuring that you retain that talent and ensuring the satisfaction of your team. We talked earlier about the D&I disconnect, that people focus on diversity, but they focus on it because it's easy to define and measure, and not on inclusion because inclusion can be hard, even just to define, let alone to measure. A quote that we often use, and probably a lot of you have heard, is that diversity is being invited to the party while inclusion is being asked to dance. And that difference between being at the table or at the party in this example and actually engaging and being part of it. So we have actually found a way to measure inclusion, and we're excited to share a little bit about that with you next. The challenge in inclusion, again, in measuring it, is that it's invisible. We often use the analogy of healthcare here because it's one of those things where you only notice it if you don't have it. If when I joined today, maybe my arm was in a sling or something like that, you might ask me about it, but you'd at least, I would think, at least notice it. And so that's very analogous with inclusion, where if you don't experience it, you're very aware of it, but quite often when you are in a space, inclusion may or may not be top of mind unless it's something that you're not experiencing. It's also the most difficult for those to notice who are the most included. So typically individuals in majority situations or of majority status are going to be the ones who are least likely to notice inclusion and even be aware that it exists. So when you go to the doctor, there's typically a questionnaire of sorts that you have to fill out. And they don't just ask you how healthy you are on a scale of, of 1 to 10, what's your health today? They go through this process of asking you about specific symptoms and use those symptoms and those groupings of symptoms to come up with diagnoses. We do something very similar with inclusion, because inclusion can be measured by looking for specific symptoms. Through the research and work that we've done, we have come up with these 9 categories of inclusion. And we use these to be able to measure inclusion. So you can see there's several different categories here. There's things like compensation and benefits, workplace interactions, recognition, etc. To give you a little bit of a feel of what we mean by this, we've got some examples here. And we typically measure inclusion by experiences of exclusion, because again, that has to do with that dynamic of not being able to experience it and feel it if you're not actually the one who's being excluded. So workplace interactions, that's one of the categories. Here's an example of it. My colleagues keep making fun about my accent. That's an interaction between colleagues that can result in in those feelings of exclusion. Respect. When we speak with investors or clients, they always talk to my male co-founder, even though I am the CEO. And then work-life balance, which has to do with the access of flex time and a variety of other supports and access for employees. So my boss sends me Slack messages, or it could be text, whatever it may be, on weekends, and expects me to reply immediately. So that lack of boundaries there. So these are just some of the examples that we hear when we go into places and talk with them about experiences of exclusion, which are an indication, again, of the level of inclusion in cultures. So next week, as Phoebe mentioned earlier, we are going to be conducting another workshop, same place, same time, just a different date, specifically focused on inclusion, where we're going to delve deeper into looking at why inclusion is key to the success of your company, and then talking about how you can create an inclusive culture and environment that will increase your company's performance, create a happier team, increase loyalty, and all of that stuff that we're all looking for. So with that, I'm going to kick it back over to Paulo to talk to us a little bit about how COVID-19 is impacting D&I and what to do during these times. You're muted again.
Yeah, I found it this time. This time I found it. Thank you. And I want to emphasize again, next week is going to be a much deeper dive into inclusion, and also in addition to just talking more deeply about inclusion, there will be a number of very specific tips that we're going to give people about how to create a more inclusive environment. So again, we encourage people to attend if you're interested in learning about that. We thought it would be worth it, given the dramatic changes that all of us have experienced in the last, well, now 6 months, I guess, 5 months, to talk a little bit about how we see now, with a bit of a retrospective lens, the impact that diversity and inclusion within companies and startups in particular has had, is having, and will have on the ability of companies to succeed. So we're looking at it historically. Before COVID-19, companies that were already embracing inclusive practices such as flex time and remote work were better prepared and more adaptable, and were able to adjust more quickly to the need to move to entirely remote workforce. And secondly, we found that company policies that have inclusive benefits like unlimited personal time off and other kinds of policies allow for a less stressful and more inclusive transition. So this is where we can see that being inclusive and more diverse actually gave you a leg up, and we actually have heard this from a number of companies, in being able to deal with the pandemic. Now, during the pandemic itself, which I would characterize as where we are still today, a culture of inclusion can really be helpful in giving greater support to the staff and manage the stress of cuts and layoffs. A lot of companies are really suffering because, on top of having to either lay off people or adapt, if they do not have a very inclusive environment, then people get stressed out and they may leave. They may really, their performance may plummet. So these are things that are actually having a very tangible impact on the ability of companies to perform. And in general, having inclusive policies and practices also makes it easier for people, for example, that have caretaking responsibilities, or other situations, somebody at home that is sick, or maybe they've been sick themselves, or maybe there's just issues with children running around the house. And having a more inclusive workplace and inclusive policies can be extremely helpful for that. What we think is also very important to consider is what's going to happen when, I don't know that we will ever go back to normal, but as the pandemic subsides and as we start to go back to something that is maybe more similar to what we had before, we think that one of the things that's going to be crucial is that companies that have demonstrated that they are very inclusive and that already have some diversity are going to have an increased ability to attract talent who will benefit from having a more flexible workplace. And for example, this is actually a topic that came up when I was there in person, the fact that when you, in terms of, let's say, ethnicity, there is certainly not as much diversity in Vermont as there might be in a place like New York or maybe someplace in the South. But once you realize that it's possible to work remotely, those barriers basically melt. So it can become much easier to hire somebody from any geographical location, which means that it also becomes easier to identify people who may be, from a demographic perspective, at least, and cultural perspective, different from the norm and the majority of your company. But another important point to keep in mind is that as we go back to the thought of inclusion and how important that is for the feeling of satisfaction, which in turn impacts retention and productivity, if you have an inclusive environment, even where you're going through hard times, what will happen is that when things get better, your people will stick with you and new people will be attracted. But if you have not done a very good job of being inclusive, and if you've inadvertently created a lot more stress than other companies, what you may find is that as the economy turns around, some of your best people may be the first ones to leave when they see opportunities to jump ship and get a job somewhere else. So again, we think that being inclusive as a part of the fabric of your organization is crucial to your success, especially during difficult times like COVID-19. And then finally, a couple of points specifically about remote work. And again, this is a topic that came up back in February when I was there in person, and it was brought up by some people that were there during the first time that we did the workshop. But I want to emphasize a couple of the pros and cons that we can see a bit more clearly now through the lens of time, right? Hindsight is 2020. One of the things that is clear about remote work is that, as I've already mentioned, is that it gives you the ability to hire from diverse geographical areas. It's also, in some cases, reducing the stress of daily grind for some employees. And I want to pause on that for 1 second. When you hear stories from people of color, from people with disabilities, from people that maybe are members of the LGBTQ community, you often hear about the daily grind, microaggressions, having to put up a face and having to feel like they don't belong at work. And that can be really tough when you have to be in the office all the time. To some extent, we've been hearing about people saying that being able to work from home actually relieves some of the pressure. And then, of course, there is the idea that you can have greater flexibility and work-life balance when you're working from home, and when people get accustomed to the fact that, hey, you may be doing a workshop, but you may get interrupted by your kid coming in asking for a snack or whatever the case may be. However, we have to be very careful because there are also some negative aspects of the remote work. One of them is that we tend to assume that everybody has equal access to broadband. Hey, I have incredibly fast Wi-Fi here and I can, in general, work without any problems. That's not the case for everybody. But more importantly, it's not just a matter of Wi-Fi, right? It's also a matter of, you may live in a situation where you're sharing a small dwelling with a large household. You may have large family. You may not have a space where you can have the luxury of being entirely by yourself and having undisturbed conversations. So there are privileges that many of us have that not everybody has that can become heightened by the remote work, and we need to be mindful of that. On a more interpersonal relationship level, some exclusionary behaviors that take place in real life can actually be heightened on video calls. I am sitting here talking to my laptop, right? I know that there's a bunch of you out there, but I can't see you. I can't see your faces unless I want to give up, and then I wouldn't be able to see my PowerPoint. And it's really frustrating, right? It's a very different thing. But sometimes, for all I know, some of you could be off reading something, or you may feel very disenfranchised, or there may be a person that dominates the conversation during a regular meeting that will find it even easier to do so in an online Zoom kind of setting. And that ultimately leads to people making or finding it easier to become detached and disenfranchised. And these are really, really dangerous things to do. There are lots of tips in their D&I toolkit, but even doing things like making sure that whenever you start a meeting, you always ask people how they feel, making sure that you don't demand that people have their video on unless you really, really need to have video on, because in some cases, people just automatically assume that that's going to be the case, but it could be very uncomfortable. Some people, again, may not be okay sharing with everybody else. So if you want to have video on, make sure that you give people a heads up. So in conclusion, I hope that through this presentation, you have appreciated a little bit more than you maybe did before why diversity and inclusion are crucial elements of the success of any startup, and that embracing D&I early is much easier than trying to fix it later. In particular, the one thing that we feel very strongly about and have increasing amounts of data, evidence, and research to support it is the idea that inclusion is particularly crucial to your success. Even if you live in an environment where demographic diversity may not be as visible, the fact is there are still many, many ways in which people can feel excluded, whether it's because you're not wearing the right clothes, or because you have a funny accent, or because whatever the case might be, your gender, it can even be what school you went to. Being inclusive is something that benefits absolutely everybody. And then lastly, we've now said this ad nauseum, but I want to emphasize, don't think of this as being the end of our relationship with you. We really are committed to supporting all of your efforts to become more inclusive and more diverse. And with the support of the Kaufman Foundation, we have a number of additional resources, including the toolkit that we keep talking about. And I know Tony's going to be sharing the link in a moment on the chat channel. We have monthly webinars and office hours. The office hours, by the way, are great because any questions that you have that you don't feel comfortable asking during a workshop, or maybe you didn't think about it, or maybe there are things that you just are curious about. We have weekly time slots where you can sign up for office hours and ask us any question that can, where we can help you with diversity and inclusion. On the website that has the toolkit, there is also a measuring inclusion ebook that goes into a lot more detail about how we define inclusion and how to measure it, and a list of job boards and hiring resources, as well as a number of other great, valuable resources. So we're going to stop there. We have almost 10 minutes left for Q&A, and I'm going to stop and take a break, and hopefully there will be some questions, and we'd be more than happy to answer them.
Yes, so we've already gotten at least one question that came in from Stacy. Stacy asked, we're committed to D&I and also committed to hiring in Vermont. Any tips for combining those two goals? To start off with, I would just say definitely checking out our webinar that Paulo mentioned earlier, where we talk about the 6 ways that D&I impacts recruiting. There's some really great tips, great resources in there as well that can help in that process. Paulo, what else would you add?
Well, I would also add that in my experience, I've found that even when you are, first of all, even when you are in a homogeneous or less heterogeneous location, there are always pockets of diversity, and it's a matter of looking hard. It's a matter of actually going out of your way. And as Tony pointed out, there are some resources available, but if you go to the local universities, if you make sure that you look outside of your immediate network, I think that you will be surprised the fact that there is greater diversity. But also don't underestimate the importance of, for example, hiring people with disabilities. And I am sure that in Vermont, there are just as many people with disabilities as there are in the rest of the United States. Even gender, sexual harassment and sexual discrimination and sexism in general are actually quite present. We tend to think a lot about race, but gender certainly is a big issue. And practicing some of these ideas about being inclusive is a very valuable thing to do, and it can help you even if you're hiring locally, even if superficially may not look as diverse. Yeah, and by the way, I did want to make one comment. Stan had asked a question about the automatic transcription. It turns out that if you use PowerPoint on a reasonably new laptop, that's actually a feature that they've added recently, and it's done completely automatically. So I use PowerPoint, Microsoft Office 365 on a MacBook Pro, and all of a sudden this thing started doing it for me. There is a little checkbox if you go into the slideshow setup, and depending on the CPU that you have, it will give you that option if you have enough CPU power, and it's a phenomenal tool. So yes, I'm glad that you noticed that.
All right, so we've got actually one more poll that I'm just going to pop up while you all are thinking of your final question. And this poll is going to be a little bit different than the last polls that we've done, because we're not going to actually share the results. This is just for us to gauge what this experience was like for you. So the poll is popping up now. I can also share my screen so you can see it bigger as well. And this poll asks, this workshop has increased my understanding of how D&I can benefit my company, and then it's just a scale of how much you agree with that statement. Again, your responses will not be shared. We're just are collecting this to help us in continuously improving. All right, wonderful. And we're going to end the poll now. Thank you so much for all of you who participated. I'm going to stop my share so that we can answer any additional questions that you have. And I think, Phoebe, there may have been one that came in for you that you wanted to ask us about.
So as you mentioned earlier, often exclusion is practiced by those who have never felt very much excluded themselves, either like in the world in general or in their company. And so for someone looking to talk about inclusion with a leadership team, or someone who isn't open-minded to like being empathetic to somebody feeling excluded, Do you have any strategies for approaching these types of conversations? How to navigate that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I want to underscore something that you said. There are two complementary aspects that are very closely tied together about that invisibility issue. One of them is that what we said specifically was that people who enjoy inclusion the most are the ones who are least likely to see it. It is also sometimes the case that those are the people that are the ones that actually do things that make other people feel excluded. That's not always the case, right? So what I mean by that is the following: if you are the executive of a large company and you're white and male, the probability that you're feeling excluded because somebody picked on you because of your race, your gender, your ethnicity, whatever, is virtually zero. And that makes you completely unaware. There may also be situations in which you're making comments to people without realizing the impact that your words have on those people. Now, what we suggest is two things. One of them is really, it's fairly easy to educate yourself, but you need to realize that because of the sensitivity around these issues, unless you have practices and procedures in place that make it possible for people to feel comfortable voicing those concerns, then that can become a challenge, because people will keep those things inside. They will not tell you about it. They will be intimidated. Now, you have to be, so if you're a leader, you have to be very genuine about saying, if I ever say anything to you that makes you feel uncomfortable, if I ever do anything, then either tell me about it, or better yet, here's a person that you should talk to let them know that I've done something, and you can confide in them anonymously. One thing that we offer that is more for larger companies, typically it works best if you have at least 100 or a couple hundred people, is that on the Aleria side, on the for-profit side, we offer what we call our inclusion assessments. And that's actually a workshop in which we have developed a tool where we ask people to share specific examples of times when they felt excluded. And this is all done confidentially. And we ask them to indicate which of the categories it belongs with and who might be the sources. And we find that that gives a phenomenal kind of an X-ray view into A, the kinds of ways in which people feel excluded in the company, and B, which specific segments of your company have those issues. And we've done this now for numerous companies, and it's mind-blowing. I mean, people look at it, it's like, oh my God, I had no idea. I had no idea that things that people don't realize, like being disrespectful during meetings, something that we just behave the way that we normally behave and don't realize that we're having such a negative impact on people. So if anybody's interested in that, next week's seminar or webinar on inclusion will give you a hint about how you can do some of those measurements yourself. And if anybody has a larger company and they're interested in working with us, we're more than happy, because sometimes working with an external partner does have the benefits that it gives that additional layer of confidentiality and comfort.
Thanks so much, Paolo. I included the link to next week's inclusion webinar in the chat. Just keeping an eye on time, it looks like we're going to wrap it up for today. There's also a workshop survey. If you could just literally take 3 minutes and complete that, that again helps us with continuous improvement, helps us in, we're constantly refining the content that we put into these presentations. As those of you who may have joined us back in February may have learned, I know a few of you have learned a few additional things, so that's wonderful to hear. And I want to reiterate the things that Paolo said as far as us being a resource. Please reach out to us if there's any way we can help you. And then also office hours, if there were questions that came up for you today, things that come up as you're just going through your day-to-day after this experience that you want to process with us, things that we can support you in, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I'll throw it over to Phoebe just to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Paolo and Tony. This has been just super helpful to see really visually these advantages and use your research as a foundation to really make sure inclusion is inherent from the beginning. And so thank you for this workshop. I think our community certainly has a lot to think about on our own journeys towards anti-racism. And I'm excited to continue this conversation next week. Hope to see everyone here.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for hosting us, Phoebe, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.